I'm Carvin, an Italian journalist, and I'm very happy to be here today introducing this panel, the Snowden effect on journalism, because of the great panelists we have, journalists, intellectuals, activists, who have been at the forefront of the many revolutions that the world of journalism and of communication has undergone in the last years. We're talking of, data journalism, the innovative use of social media by news organizations, the challenges to free speech and freedom of expression, and the empowerment of users in the digital age are all topics that they largely addressed in their careers. And then there has been the tornado Snowden. At the beginning of the first revelations leaked by Edward Snowden to the press about the NSA files and about the huge programs of surveillance, I remember there were many colleagues, especially in Italy, who didn't seem much interested in the breaking and ongoing news, which lately, or actually then won the Pulitzer Prize. I found that skepticism really amazing when coming from journalists, just for this simple reason. The Snowden story and the NSA files together say so much about the digital rights and the freedom of expression, about internet and what has become and what it will become if we don't do anything, and about the way journalism is changing and adapting it to a digital environment. So it tells things about also the relationship between journalists and their sources, and about media and governments. So it was really a huge story, full of meaning and also things to understand and also challenges, I think. And of course, it tells a lot also about something that even the most paranoid among us didn't think, or at least couldn't prove. So the many levels of suspicionless surveillance conducted by governments, especially by the US and the UK ones. So I'd like to start from this and to introduce James Ball, who is a journalist from The Guardian, who has been working on the NSA files. He's been also working a lot on data journalism and on investigative reporting. So I would leave him to introduce and to speak a little about his work, especially in the last year.
So, hey, good afternoon, everyone. Is that working? Yep, looks like you can hear me. So hopefully you already know what Snowden was doing and that The Guardian reported a lot of it, as did all kinds of other news outlets. So I might try and dive straight into looking at kind of the 4 lessons that we should be trying to take and should be trying to think about in terms of either how Snowden and the aftermath to it has changed journalism or what it's perhaps woken us up to. I think the very first thing to start would be security. I think it's gone from that thing that one reporter kept annoying their editors about to something that everyone knows. The Guardian might be the eye of the storm, but my editor-in-chief within 12 months has gone from never having heard of Tails or encryption to knowing how to use both and having his own setups. You know, at The Guardian now, every senior editor has a PGP key, as well as most of the reporters. People know about air gaps, people know about all sorts. You might want to say legitimately that we should have had more experience in this earlier, but I'm pretty pleased with how far we've come, how quickly, and I think this is a really important thing to widen out. It's kind of the first principle of journalism is that you sort of go to the wall for your sources, and in the digital era, that doesn't mean just not saying it in court or not saying it to authorities. It's incredibly easy to sell out a source without even knowing you've done it. We have the information of how good agencies, hackers, all sorts of other people are at picking up this information. We've got to make it as hard as we conceivably can for them to do so. No security is perfect, nothing's ever going to make it impossible, but we can make it much, much harder than most of us do. And I think one of the very good effects in Snowden has been to actually bring this debate and bring a lot of these tools and a lot of the work that actually people like Gillian have been doing into the sort of centre of mainstream journalistic practice and debate. That's very important. The second is censorship. You know, The Guardian faced fairly significant censorship and legal restrictions. I think more than really, certainly more than any of the US, sort of solely US news organizations that faced this. I'm sure you all know we had to smash up a whole bunch of laptops and hard disks in the basements of our offices as 2 GCHQ staffers watched. We had sort of various other efforts of intimidation or so on. There were actually several steps that helped us sort of resist that. One was doing a kind of a thing which doesn't come naturally to any news organization, which was to share the material with other news organizations, rivals, if you want. We picked ProPublica and the New York Times, both of whom were really great journalistic partners. But that meant we could say, in all honesty, do what you want to The Guardian, these stories will still get out, our research will still get out. You can't actually censor these other organizations. We have to carry on thinking in those terms. In different ways, it won't always just be it won't just be the UK that's censoring, it won't be just any particular country. In different ways, even the US can put on pressure not to publish. I mean, thinking through Snowden, I can only think of one story that the US tried to get the Times and the Guardian not to publish. And that was done with a voluntary request, and both organizations said, no, we're going to publish, I'm pleased to say. But thinking about how you can work cross-border, cross-news organization, that kind of stuff, very important. I think the third point is thinking about this idea of the 4-point fifth estate. The Guardian published the first Snowden story. We certainly did not publish the only Snowden story. News organizations and journalists around the world worked on bits of it, and it came to Glenn and Laura rather than to... Closer? So, sorry. And it came to Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, who are sort of both very experienced and very good journalists, but they are not traditional journalists. They are not affiliated to news organizations nearly so tightly as people like me are. And it went to them with a lot of thought by Edward Snowden. He chose people who could publish even if news organizations said no, who could publish if editors said no, who could publish across multiple places. I think trying to work out how we interact with journalists who don't fit that traditional newsroom mold, and with activists, there's a lot of good research and good journalism coming out of NGOs. How do we use that? How do we use organizations like WikiLeaks and its successors? How much can we partner? How much can we take on what they do? I think is a very relevant question. And we have to try and make sure that we don't just become some ivory tower that becomes irrelevant. The final point, and I'm aware I've talked for ages, sorry, is actually, I think it has re-established a role for the fourth estate, for well-resourced newsrooms and for big news brands in doing this kind of very risky and very important journalism. The Guardian threw an incredible amount of money and resource behind doing this journalism, and I know the Washington Post and other outlets did the same. The legal expertise, the flights, having the infrastructure there to make sure the stories were published, were interactive, were explained, or accessible. Having reporters who could do things like sort of ring round 40 European editors to express support when we were coming under political pressure. And we're very glad to all of the editors who did, thank you. But who could do that meant that the team that was meant to be going through the documents, doing that kind of reporting, could focus just on doing that. And having that kind of infrastructure, that publishing architecture, all of the people that you don't think of when you think about how Snowden happened, they were actually why it all could work. The reason that Glenn could write so many stories, that people like you and McCaskill, like me, like Spencer Ackerman, could work full-time for 9 months on it, was because so many other people were taking care of so many other things, and that all of that journalism was being funded by the day-to-day work that everyone else does. You know, do not expect the Snowden stuff to have been good for anyone's bottom lines, I can assure you. So, you know, I think that would be my thoughts. We have to think about security, we have to think about censorship, we have to think about how we work with new models of journalism and new types of journalists, but we should also remember this was actually a vindication for having sort of the traditional news org, for having the traditional bundle, and trying to work out how to make that relevant in this century. I think that's my first thoughts. Thank
you, James. And talking of a new model of journalism, I would like to introduce now Andy Carvin, who has been a social media strategist, well known. Well, you have been defined like the man who tweets a revolution, and of course he has been very well known in curating Twitter feeds and social media and working on them. And now he recently joined First Look Media, which is the new journalism venture that includes also Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, so some also the reporters who worked on the NSA files. And, well, I would say a dream team of reporters. So what's your role, and I would ask you, what's your role and your goal there, and how do you think to engage the public, or what kind of work do you think you would like to do there?
Well, my role so far is in the process of being defined. Even though we have significant funding from Pierre Omidyar, in many ways we're like many other startups where we don't have business cards, we don't have job titles for everyone yet. I don't have an office. Actually, I take that back. I have an office in Washington, D.C. that has no furniture. So it's very much a startup in that sense. Ostensibly, though, I came on board to essentially be a managing editor for collaboration with the public, or social media. I mean, there's so many ways you could define it, but we're struggling to come up with a title for me that doesn't involve really hackneyed buzzwords. But the real idea for me coming on board is that I spent the last 7 years at NPR, National Public Radio in the US, and I spent much of that time experimenting with social media to help NPR's journalists work more closely with the public, diversify our sources on the ground in different places, and bring in types of expertise that we didn't have in-house. And you know, we had our successes, we had our failures, but overall it was, I thought, a really productive and fun way to spend 7 years. But at the same time, we were still a legacy news organization whose bread and butter was still producing audio for radio. And so when First Look was first announced, I was really intrigued by it because here was a news organization that was going to receive a significant amount of funding, but didn't carry any particular type of legacy baggage. It wasn't connected to any type of broadcast network, newspaper, magazine, etc. It was an opportunity to start with a clean slate. And that included developing a newsroom where both social media use and security are baked in from day one. To give you an example, on my very first day on the job at First Look, they told me, okay, expect to spend much of the day doing orientation, taking different tutorials and things, and so I figured it was going to be the typical type of human resources bureaucracy you go through on your first couple days on the job. Instead, the first thing they asked me to do was to take a primer to revisit my skills with PGP, which I hadn't used in some time. And so, and there were several other security tutorials that they made us take that first day. And so, whether you're coming to First Look as a journalist, as a lawyer, as an accountant, working in human resources, everyone's using PGP and other levels of security on top of it as well. So far, we've launched one site, The Intercept, which Glenn and Laura and Jeremy are working on. And later this year, we're going to launch one for Matt Taibbi as well on corporate corruption. But beyond that, it's still an open debate what we're going to do. We have the luxury of time on our side, so rather than feeling forced to dive in and build a newsroom and a platform by this summer, we've got not only months, but a couple of years to work out the details of what kind of journalistic infrastructure we'd like to have for a whole new type of newsroom.
Thank you, Andy. So if security is entering newsrooms, is entering new media organizations, but I would ask, what about users who are kind of left alone in front of the NSA files and documents? So I would like to leave the word to Dan Gilmore, who has been writing and working a lot on, again, social media, grassroots journalism, so also looking at the user perspective. And you recently also, I think, wrote about the way governments and corporations are centralizing control over technology and over communications. So, and you are asking, what can we do to reverse, this trend, or can we do something? And so I'm very interested in.
I probably should defer to Jillian on the specifics of these things. She's more expert on that. By the way, thank you for having me here. And I want to say that the hardest working people here are the people in the interpreter booth in the back, and thank you very much for what you do. So I want to go back about 15 or 17 years. In the 1990s, I put PGP encryption software on my computer. I had the help of the man who wrote it, so it wasn't all that hard for me, but it took a while. What I'm intrigued by is that a few months ago, I sat around a room with people where we were helping each other install the current version of this kind of software and sign keys for each other. And what I realized was it is not significantly easier today to use encryption in your email than it was 15 years ago, which tells a lot about how governments in particular, but I think increasingly also corporate entities, don't really want us to use this, and they've been very careful about persuading commercial software vendors to not make it part of what we do. I think we have to turn our whole culture of how we work online as users to basically take back control that we are losing to these central entities. Governments and companies are, in some cases, just taking it from us. In other cases, we are handing it to them willingly. If you carry a mobile phone, you are certainly giving people who do surveillance all kinds of ways of spying on you. These are spying devices as much as communications devices. So we're going to have to work on this over time, and I don't want to get into too many details, but I do believe that we're seeing the beginnings, anyway, of recognition among the public, and in part largely based on what The Guardian, The Washington Post, and others have done to alert people to the threat that exists, but also other journalists looking at what the companies are doing in the area of surveillance. But until the public, until all of us start to wake up on this and say, well, we're going to trade back some of the convenience that we have wanted. In return, we're going to get some more control back over what we do and how we communicate. Until that happens, I'm not very optimistic that we're going to be able to avoid what is going on. One quick thing I want to say, I wanted to add a point to what James said. One Snowden effect that I think has been wonderful is that journalists everywhere, at least in America, not just at the 3 news organizations, but people keep following up the story. It's now something, and that's unusual. Journalists tend to say, oh, they did the story, we're going to pretend it doesn't exist because we didn't do it first. In this case, I'm very happy to see journalists are saying, yes, we all need to do this. We all have to pay attention. We all have to further the story. And that's, I think, one of the best Snowden effects.
Definitely. So, Gillian York is the director for International Freedom of Expression of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is, if you don't know it, it's one of the main organizations fighting for digital freedom and digital rights. And so I would like to ask you, what kind of challenge do we face in order to help people to change their online behavior and also to better protect their privacy? By the way, do they care? And in any case, should they care? Why? Like, why should they care? If you can also explain us why it's so important. It's not just a theoretical thing.
Absolutely. So I'm opening my laptop because I just want to pull up a couple statistics to start answering that question. So PEN, the International Writers Association, their American Center in New York, did a survey of their membership. And their membership is journalists, novelists, other writers, and found that 1 in 6 of their writers has avoided writing or speaking on a topic that they thought would subject them to surveillance. Another 1 in 6 has seriously considered doing so. So while James was talking about the censorship, the government censorship of newsrooms, this is talking about the self-censorship of ideas, and that is absolutely a Snowden effect. It's also an effect of, there have been a lot of other discussions and revelations about surveillance that have happened over the past few years, and we shouldn't forget that as well, that have happened with other countries. But this in particular, in the US, has had a really strong effect on the way that people are discussing surveillance. And discussing anything really. And so when you look at that, you've got 2 individual effects. You have self-censorship, and you have the effect on association. And so we've seen a really strong and powerful and unfortunate negative effect on the way that people think about with whom they associate. And this is because the metadata that is captured in the NSA surveillance can link us very easily to the other people that we're associating with online, through email, on Facebook, elsewhere. And I'll be honest, that's something that really concerns me. When I started to think about who is in my network, I started to go, okay, well, I've got these activists in the Middle East, I've got these folks that are involved with WikiLeaks, I've got these people, and going, uh-oh, like, what have I done? How is this going to affect me? And then, I think that there's also 2 really positive effects, positive Snowden effects, so to speak. One is a greater awareness of mass surveillance, both in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere in the world, but then also the increased use of cryptography. And so when you think about individuals and how they're affected by these revelations, a lot of it comes down to, how do I protect myself? How do I ensure that I don't have to have that fear? How do I ensure that I'm not being linked to the people in my network? And I know a lot of people have mentioned PGP and Tails and other tools. And I think that part of the difficulty there that everyone is experiencing is that indeed they are difficult to use. And whenever someone comes up to me after a talk and tells me, oh, no, of course, it's very easy, I have to hold my fist back. So there's that. They're difficult to use. They're sometimes you're not entirely sure that you're using them correctly. And at other times, they're impossible to use. And so that is to say things like Tor, which is a fantastic way of ensuring your anonymity online. If anyone's ever tried to use it in Lebanon or another country with a slow network, you'll know that it's virtually impossible to do so. And so what we're doing right now, and what I'm seeing a lot of organizations doing and a lot of funding going towards, which makes me very happy, is both trying to develop better tools that are both privacy enhancing, but also that have better design, better user interfaces, and funding going towards better user education. So there are quite a few good resources out there. I noticed that I think on Friday or Saturday, some folks from the Tactical Technology Collective are giving a training on the use of some of these tools. So that's fantastic. They do great work. But there's not enough of that out there. There's not enough of that in multiple languages. There's not enough of that geared toward different audiences. And so we're undertaking a big project like that too that's given us a lot of time to think and test these ideas out on different groups and constituencies to try to figure out what kind of language and what kind of education platform or system works. But I think that there's a long road, a long challenge ahead in ensuring that more people are using this, because it's not just a matter of journalists using it, it's also a matter of them using it with their sources, who are sometimes difficult to convince or to train. It's a matter of all of us using it, and sort of, if you think about the concept of herd immunity, where everyone is vaccinated so that we're all safer, more protected against viruses. It's the same kind of idea in that if just a few people are using these tools, they're much more easy to spot, and it also doesn't do much for the other folks out there. And so it's really important that we're all starting to think about ensuring our own security online, taking responsibility for that.
Right, absolutely. Thank you, Gillian. I would like to go back to James again, and since you had a very interesting and insider view as a reporter in the NSA files, so I would like to ask you, really, as a journalist, what was most challenging, analyzing a lot of documents, verification, redaction, the editorial decisions about how to give accounts of also very complicated things, very technical matters sometimes. And also the challenge you talked about before, the challenge of networking with other newspapers, rivals, okay? So I don't know if you can give us some insight about some of these aspects.
Well, I mean, Yep. So this is kind of horribly messy. It's sort of, you're asking me how the sausage is made, and that's never that pretty. But I will try and give you a sort of cleaned up version of it. But it was really funny just how much, especially kind of from the opponents of this sort of stuff, how much emphasis was put on the timing of particular stories, where people would just sort of say, oh, this has clearly been timed to do maximum damage to X, Y, or Z, often attributing that blame to Snowden. I will add the sole blame for any timing actually of anything we published, lies with The Guardian, and specifically, frankly, my bosses, so they can take it up with them. But I think this stems from this idea that you would see one document that very clearly set out exactly what was happening in our news story, and we would just merrily copy it out and then write it and done. Nothing could be nearer, further from how it was. This is an absolute mess of interlinking documents with lots of little bits of pictures and lots of stuff at higher classification than was got at. It's a little bit like a team of you trying to kind of get the shape of an elephant by occasionally getting to prod it with your finger. You're trying to separate out how to tell a story, what parts of it are relevant, because all of these systems join up with each other, they all integrate with each other. But do you write one 20,000-word opus that joins it all together and is incomprehensible to everyone, including the person writing it? Or do you try and sort of talk about, here's the effort against encryption, here's what they did with webcams, here's what they did with phones, and that was the approach that we tried to take. And so for one story, we might have read and sort of understood and synthesized information from about 150 documents, it might lean much more heavily on 2 or 3, which we would publish and extract. But this idea of one document, one story is not remotely how it worked. So the first thing that you're kind of doing is trying to work out, okay, what's got a narrative, what's important? And then there are very, very significant legal challenges in terms of prosecution, in terms of harm of all sorts, that could be done with any of these. And so part of what we had to say was, what's the public interest in publishing this? If someone turns around and says, you have made our surveillance harder and therefore this could have these bad consequences, what's our response? What is the reason that we have said this information has to be in the public domain? And it can't just be that it's salacious or that it's interesting. There's got to be a substance to it. And so for every single conversation we published, for every single story that we published, we had this conversation, and we had it in earnest, because that line would be in a different place for different people within The Guardian, within partner organizations, and so on. And so then shaping these stories is incredibly difficult. And then writing them to try and make them comprehensible. And each time we reread one of these, we think, could have explained that better, could have done that differently. But some of these stories have had 17 drafts. I think one of the sort of unsung heroes of Snowden is Stuart Miller, the deputy editor of The Guardian, and a kind of grumpy Scottish bastard, Guardian US, who, honestly, he line by lined so many of those Snowden stories, and if it weren't for him, you would not have understood them. I know Glenn, Laura, all kinds of people would quite happily credit him. We could have strangled him at times, but he was an absolute, utter angel on this stuff. If anyone's tweeting it, can you do the angel bit as well as the grumpy bastard bit? Because otherwise, I'm in trouble. But so these took incredible editing effort, and then starts the process of going to GCHQ, going to the NSA. We went on all but one story that involved the UK. We also went to the DA Notice Committee. This is a kind of voluntary, regulatory, self-censorship, if you like, body. And again, that's just a step to show we were being responsible. It's another outlet for the UK government to raise any specific security concerns. I will add, to the best of my knowledge, The Guardian is the only UK news organisation that does not share copy with the DA Notice Committee ahead of publication. So they did not see any of these stories before the public did, nor did the NSA, nor did GCHQ, unless they took them off us. We raised the points, we talked about the documents, we had conversations on and off the record. They would make specific requests. In one occasion, they asked us not to publish a story. It was the encryption story. And sometimes we would accede to those requests, and sometimes we wouldn't. What we redacted and what we didn't, we did off our editorial judgment, informed by the specific concerns made by intelligence agencies. Our general stance was actually, when we were partnering, to let each news organization make its own choices. We might relay concerns that an agency had given to us, but the New York Times chose what it would publish, we chose what we would publish, ProPublica the same. So there was no agreements or blanket kind of rules on who would publish what. No one's editorial structure was undermined. Finally, there's just the weird logistics of this stuff. We couldn't have any of it in England, so all the material was in the US. Thankfully, we have a large independent US operation. But writing stories on the UK intelligence scene from the US is quite a strange thing to have to do, especially if you're British, and was a very surreal thing for us. And so sometimes before we published, we would have a story ready to go, but we'd want to brief our UK national security editor and a couple of reporters so that they were ready to pick it up and follow it up and do some on-the-ground work. And so you'd have to make a quick trip to the UK, not carrying anything, not doing anything, but have a chat through this forthcoming story, and then hop on a plane and get back, because you couldn't have it on the phone. and we didn't want to spill confidential details over these kind of lines. So I think I flew about 130,000 miles last year. So like one of the Snowden effects on my kind of life has been I've got a load of air miles, but wasted a lot of my life on planes. So yeah, that's kind of the messy world of how these things got there. And yeah, I really hope no one reads drafts 1 to 16 of some of these stories, because honestly, if you thought the published ones were a bit of a mess, sorry. But the first versions, oh my gosh.
Thank you, James. I actually joining from what James said. I would like to ask Dan Gilmore that you wrote some years ago a famous book. It was entitled "With the Media," right? So I would like to ask you: are we still the media after everything came after all this scenario? And also, I think that one of the positive effects of the Snowden story was that there is a lot of talk now about re-decentralizing internet, re-decentralizing tools, platforms. I think also you wrote about that. Actually, I think you wrote also an article. It was very interesting about the indie web movement. So I don't know if you could a little bit talk about this.
Sure. May I follow up on one thing? He mentioned the encryption story that NSA and GCHQ tried to persuade them not to run. For those who don't know what that story was, it was basically a story that said that NSA and its partners had effectively sabotaged the encryption that we all use on the internet. And that the word sabotage is a deliberate choice. And it's the one that was in at least Bruce Schneier's piece and others. This was clearly a design to make the internet less secure. In fact, quite insecure. It amazes me that the government would think that journalists would not publish that story, given how important that was. And I still think that that may be the most important thing we've heard so far from these documents, that the communication systems that we all rely on, that our governments made a deliberate effort to make them insecure, with all kinds of consequences beyond their ability to find bad people. And I wish that journalists worldwide would focus on that, because that's a very big deal. The question of getting back some control for ourselves, and Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web, essentially, he has called for what he's calling a re-decentralization. Getting back to the original idea of the internet, which is a network of networks, and where the control essentially was out at the edge of the networks as opposed to in the center. And again, our telecom companies, big web companies like Google, Facebook, and others, and are trying to make it all centralized again. And this is a movement to get it back out to the edges. And there are people working on some very interesting technologies. And there are also moves in a bunch of different countries that I'm not sure are good ideas. Brazil, Germany in particular, are talking about forcing the cloud companies, the people who store data, to do it in their own countries, and to have essentially separate internet systems, practically speaking, for their own countries. I think that's going to be bad for us if they succeed. Yet I completely understand why they want to do it. It sounds like a good idea, but I have a bad feeling about it for all of us. I don't want a balkanized internet. And that's where I'm afraid we're heading, and it's in significant part due to the fact that no one trusts anymore that what they're doing is secure. So I think that's the important thing that we have to think about. How are we going to get back to the promise of the internet, where the control and the innovation were out at the edges of the network, from a system where the control has moved to the center, and where a sabotage effort can actually succeed, in part because the control is now in the center.
Right. And I would like to go back to the social media and the user point of view. And again, to Andy, I would like to ask you, since lately there have been many newsrooms looking for stories on the social media, and most of the time they look for breaking news. Okay, so they want, like something breaking, and that anything else, you can find anything anywhere else. And but I think that another interesting part would be to build stories from social media, to build features, more, like long form of journalism, bottom up in some hours. So, or maybe there are also other ideas to use social media in a way that is relevant for journalism. So what do you think about it? What's your experience?
Well, I think there's absolutely an opportunity to use social media in such a way that it allows us to produce better journalism and do better reporting behind it. Of course, it's not going to be appropriate for every story. There are lots of things related to security issues, investigative reporting, where you just can't go out publicly and say, hey, we're trying to understand if the NSA is doing something to all of us. That's not going to work. But there are plenty of examples where it can work. You just sometimes have to be more subtle about it. For example, when we were at NPR, we did an investigation in collaboration with ProPublica on American veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with traumatic brain injuries, and specifically how the U.S. veterans healthcare system and their health insurance was treating them poorly. And we wanted to do this investigation, but and find people who could share their stories. But at the same time, we didn't want to go out and say, okay, so we're looking for people who can complain about the Veterans Administration and TRICARE and a few other groups that would ultimately be covered within this investigation. Fortunately, at NPR, we're also known for doing storytelling about people's lives in general, long-form audio storytelling about people and families. And so we went out on Facebook and Twitter and said, we're looking to meet up with families who have, within their families, veterans who have experienced traumatic brain injury. We want to understand better, how it's affecting their families, how their community has rallied around them or not, et cetera, et cetera. And we presented it as a human interest story. And by doing it that way, we were able to get more than enough people to respond to allow us to have a wide range of choices of people and families to study and incorporate into our investigation. So on that one hand, there was this very strong crowdsourcing element, but on the other hand, we didn't overplay our hand. We made sure that we presented it in such a way, not in a way that was misleading. We said we wanted to profile these families and the struggles they're facing, but at the same time, we wanted to use some discretion to make sure that we weren't tipping off the institutions that we were going to investigate at the same time.
Yeah.
So, so with things like that started to become routine at NPR. We would also regularly use social media to find subject matter expertise on all sorts of different things. So when, for example, the revolution started in Libya, I'm not aware of any NPR staff having reporting experience in Libya before that, but all sorts of people came out of the woodwork online who spoke the local dialects, had all sorts of experience visiting different cities so they could help us identify things in videos, give us a better understanding of the cult of personality around Gaddafi and his Green Book and other things. And of course, a number of these things we could have done by trying to find an expert at some think tank in the US. But when you do that, it's typically the same 3 or 4 people every single time. And so, while on the one hand we would do that sometimes, by explaining to our broader public that we want their expertise as well, it not only provided us with expertise, it allowed us to break away from the usual suspects, and in many cases be able to report things from an angle that otherwise we might have not even contemplated.
Right, thank you. So, Gillian, we talk a lot about, this panel about, encryption, security measure. Okay, we use PGP, we do our homework, we use the right free software, and okay, but is that enough at the end of the day? And I mean, it seems sometimes that we are facing something so big that, it's really, even if I use encryption, okay, I can use encryption or whatever, but the problem is, so huge in a way. And is there also a problem of laws, inadequate laws, that, like legislation that doesn't really is apt to, it doesn't protect our rights enough, or is there something else that we should do or address?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this in two different ways. The first is to say that I think that there's been a lot of focus over the past few months, and my organization and many organizations have focused a lot on the need to take personal responsibility for using encryption. And I absolutely agree that that's true, but I think that that's only one part of a larger strategy that needs to happen. We need to take personal responsibility, and that's really the only personal responsibility we can take, is by securing our own data and our own communications. We also, though, as a broader group and as advocates, need to fight for better legislation, better policy. We need to educate the population, make people more aware, and we need to change our culture. I was chatting, I've chatted a lot recently with Brits, and I find that Brits are perfectly fine with surveillance cameras in this way that I just don't comprehend as an American. But then I've also, just a couple nights ago, I was in Estonia, and as you know, probably we've recently sent, the US has recently sent a bunch of our troops there, and I unfortunately had a run-in with some of them in a bar where they were asking me what I did for work, and I told them, I work for the organization that's suing the NSA, and their reaction was like, why would you do that? And I had to sit there and explain to this guy why surveillance is bad. And I think I might have won him over a little bit, but for the most part, he was like, well, but if it could catch a terrorist, I don't understand. I've got nothing to hide. And that's such a common, I mean, we all go, ugh, but that's actually such a common response. A lot of people don't really have a good conception of why surveillance does matter. Why is this even a bad thing? We've got all these terrorists, we've got organized crime, we need to go after them, and hey, why not? And I mean, sometimes the constitutional argument's good enough. Sometimes it's easy enough for me to say to someone, well, hi, have you ever heard of the Fourth and the First Amendments? But that really only works on a certain part of the population. I mean, clearly it doesn't even work on our politicians. So you also have to get to the root of it, the idea that throughout history, the only way that we have made change happen, the only way that we have shifted culture is by breaking laws and by organizing. And surveillance threatens both of those things. And so I think that there's a huge cultural shift that needs to happen. But I feel as though I didn't answer your question. So the second bit that I was going to say was, is it enough? Okay, so the question was, are we doing enough? Is taking personal responsibility for the use of cryptography and encryption, is that enough? I think that this is where it gets tricky because people kind of tend to have one of two approaches. The first is, I'm going to install all of these things and use them all the time, and I'm going to panic when it goes wrong. Or the second is, it's too hard, I give up. And that one really gets to me, that second response really gets to me because, in the middle of the HIV crisis, did anyone say, oh, you know what, safe sex is too hard, I'm just going to give up? No. And on the other hand, well, I'm sure you could take that analogy to the other side too. I don't need to. But basically, what people are doing there is they're not thinking about their personal threat model. And that's a really important conversation that we need to be having as well. So we are all in the U.S. We are all either journalists or activists or writers or academics, and we all have a certain model to think about. We're probably communicating with people who are reporting on this stuff, or we ourselves are reporting on this stuff, and we have to think about certain consequences of doing that. Are we, potentially risking violation of the Espionage Act, for example? But if you are a journalist that's, say, working in China, you're looking at a completely different threat model. You're probably not too worried about the NSA, you're worried about the Chinese government, and let me tell you, their surveillance is just as good. They're not doing it to the whole world the way the US is, but the technology is just as good, and the consequences are much harsher. Same with Russia, same with a lot of other places. And so, I don't say that to diminish the problem in the US, not at all. But surveillance is happening everywhere, and what we really need to be thinking about is, rather, is it enough? The question is really, who am I protecting myself from, and what steps am I willing to take to do that?
Right. Someone said that surveillance is the business model of internet. I think Bruce Nair said that, which is kind of. So I think I would stop here and ask the audience if there are questions, because I think there could be many, and I would like to give the opportunity to people to start asking also maybe more specific questions about. Okay. Yes.
Just have to, this is not on? Yeah, there we go. Just have to warn you, Andy and I both have to leave early because we've both been put on 4 o'clock panels. So if you have questions for us, you might want to ask them first.
Right.
Hello. Snowden was in Vancouver in March with a telebot, but he suggested that sites should use SSL encryption as a general default. So is this something that newspapers are considering for their own online presences?
Maybe.
Yeah,
yes,
SSL.
maybe.
So I would say they should be, but I'll let you guys know what they are.
Yeah, I don't know many that are. We do it for The Intercept. The blog that we launched with Glenn Greenwald earlier this year. But it's not a discussion that I think has gone far enough at news organizations. I know it came up multiple times at NPR while I was there. There were technical challenges that made it somewhat difficult for us to do that, but I think the difference between starting that conversation last year and the year before that is when we had asked those types of questions the year before that, it was seen as a completely pointless academic conversation. Whereas when we started talking about it post-Snowden, while we might have gotten some pushback from our tech and our infrastructure people simply for the amount of work it would take to do it, at least they understood why the question was being raised now. And it's not even just SSL on our websites, even post-Snowden, when I left NPR at the end of last year, I could count the number of journalists in our newsroom that use PGP on one hand. There are so many aspects of this story that they've sunk in with reporters who are covering it, but they haven't sunk in terms of how it applies to their own reporting, even if they're reporting on completely other things. And so, people that we have who might be reporting in China, for example, or parts of the Middle East, they get it because they understand the consequences and they've experienced some of these things. But to explain that to a reporter that's covering something that may be a domestic issue, a domestic US issue or a political issue, it's not always top of mind. And so whether it's trying to protect the users who are coming to our site, protecting our sources, or protecting all of our journalists, I think a lot of news organizations still have a very long way to go before we really catch up to where we should be.
Right. Questions? No? Yes? Philip?
Hi, everybody. You are all based in the US, and my question is, are you satisfied with the level of public debate about Snowden's revelations, because my personal opinion is that in Italy that this didn't happen as it was supposed to be. We didn't have a very large public debate, and also the media. Carola was one of the few Italian journalists who covered the case, how it was supposed to be covered by the media. We didn't have a very much large public debate, at least it's my personal perspective about the case. So I'm wondering your opinion about that. Thank you.
So is this on yet? I'm going to try and sort of, I had a very interesting sort of thing because I spent last year traveling between, I'm really sure this is on, yes it is, yeah, no. Sorry. I spent last year traveling between the US and the UK, and that gave you insight into two very, very different public debates. Dan kind of very astutely pointed out sort of, in the US, the response of most newspapers that didn't have Snowden material was to set their national security reporters on taking it further, on expanding it, on trying to say what it did and didn't mean, on actually really reporting it and furthering the debate. In the UK, the response was, firstly, to try and ignore it and just absolutely leave it to The Guardian, and then to start a public debate as to how terrible The Guardian was, which included 3 newspapers splashing on entirely unsourced, off-the-record, and frankly mad allegations from the security services against us, to sort of encouraging MPs and others to do hit pieces. I mean, it was a really pathetic performance from the UK media, which kind of, however low your expectations of it get, it still fails to meet them. Notable exception for Channel 4 News, who partnered with us on several stories and even before then actually showed some cojones and published some stuff. The editor-in-chief of one newspaper actually genuinely wrote in a column, if MI5 tell me not to publish something, who am I to argue with them? It's your bloody job. And so, could we have had a better public debate in the US? Could it have gone further? You know, did the US still have lots of people making silly allegations? Yes, it did. But it also, thanks to its media, thanks to its civil society, thanks to much more, it got much further. I'm actually quite worried that that momentum is going. The way the security services win almost every legislative fight they get involved in, and they do it by delay when opinions against them. They wait till the public and the politicians have stopped kind of caring as much till it's out of the spotlight, and then they absolutely water down anything that's happening. And every single NSA reform bill that's still live has stalled, and they will now, we've probably got a very, very narrow window of getting anything through before the midterm elections. If anything comes back after the midterm elections, and it probably won't, it will be toothless. So it's actually right now that everyone needs to be paying attention to this debate, just as we're not. And that's kind of a shame, and that's a risk. But I think the US actually genuinely, for the first time, had a high-profile, wide debate, and the debate that people like Gillian have been working for years to try and ignite. And I think there has to be a lot of acknowledgement of all of those foundations and all of that work over years and years and years to draw attention to this and actually to get the people in place so that there were people to lead the debate once it hit the mainstream. And I think, you know, it's the whole on the shoulders of giants stuff. The Snowden stuff did not happen in a vacuum. But I think the US had a good debate. I think the UK had a pathetic debate. And I think other countries had various mixes. You know, Brazil, Germany, good debates. Italy, apparently, not so much. India, yes, India did have like huge attention to these issues, although again, very little action, I think. But
one interesting thing about these debates around the world, and every country reserves the right to spy on its own citizens. That every government says, well, no, the NSA can't do it to our citizens. We do it to our citizens. And one of the things US journalists discovered, and this is one reason we've had the debate, it had not occurred in recent years to most American journalists that government is in some very key ways an adversary, not daddy. And we have, I think it was overdue to get back to that. Journalists are also patriotic, but journalists have a job to do. Government people are patriots too. They have a job to do, and this is not going to work together well, and it shouldn't. Journalists around the world have understood that, most of them in most countries, for a long time. And I hope more of this happens in the US, but I think the debate is largely because journalists woke up in America and said, really, this is a surprise when it shouldn't have been.
So I'm going to be the one to throw a flame here and say that while I do largely agree with James that I think that in the US the debate has been fairly robust, I think that the debate has only been robust when it comes to the surveillance of US citizens, and that even the great journalists are not doing enough to talk about what the US is doing to the rest of the world. I don't think that any of the newspapers, I'm sorry, but I don't think that any of them have done a sufficient job of talking about, and I haven't seen the slides. I don't know what Snowden has given, so I don't know what's actually there and whether there is anything to be reporting on. But I have to assume so based on some of the reports that have already come out. And a couple of the things that I want to know are, what kind of data is the NSA handing over to its allies? We don't have answers to that, and there are a lot of key clues from certain Middle Eastern allies that is happening. And to what extent are we surveilling on, I don't care so much about Angela Merkel. I mean, yes, sure, she has a right to privacy too, but she's a politician. I want to know to what extent the NSA is surveilling ordinary citizens in countries all over the world, and I don't feel satisfied on that front yet.
Question there?
So back here.
Yes.
Mark Kaigwa from Kenya, running a media and storytelling consultancy there, working across Africa. And I'm curious, and you started to touch on this with your last point, but if you look at perhaps the WikiLeaks effect and how global that was, it would seem that much of the debate, and rightly so, has focused on the US, the UK, perhaps Europe. But my question to you all, and you started to touch on this a little, is in your opinion, what would be the Snowden effect globally? So have you heard anything from the emerging markets, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and just maybe any ripple effects that have worked their way back to you, any stories you've heard that really resonated with you, or any lessons really that you would share to kind of media practitioners and people across the web, digital citizens on that side of the globe? Thanks.
Who want to answer this? In fact, the global.
I guess I would urge journalists, wherever they are from, to be asking a few very key questions. One is, I'll echo Jillian's question, what is the US with the by far largest surveillance apparatus likely to be doing in our country? See if there's any way to find out anything about that. What cooperation with your security services. But more importantly, perhaps, what are your own security services doing? Your own telecoms. I would probably wonder what China is doing in most countries at this point. They're I guess, second to America in spending in this area, and certainly just as good at it, and clearly have designs on being global superpower in their own right. And I'm begging journalists everywhere to explain to your audiences how this works, why it happens, and what they can do about it individually and as a society, if they don't like the idea of their every move being tracked and their every word being recorded at some point, which is where it's all heading. And this is a global and local situation at the same time.
I'll just add a couple things to that. I'll say that, one thing is we've seen an uptick in the number of global organizations that want to start leaking platforms or to implement existing leaking platforms like SecureDrop or Global Leaks. The first really good instance of that I've seen in the developing world is Noat in Tunisia. Just launched a leaking platform there, and they've been doing leaks through other means for a couple years now, so to great effect. They were behind TuniLeaks, which got certain cables from WikiLeaks about Tunisia that reportedly had a strong effect on the uprising there. So that's one thing. But I also, I do a lot of work in the Middle East, and I spend a lot of time there. The biggest thing that I keep hearing is people talking about their own personal security and having concerns about both their own, certainly their own governments. We do know that a lot of Middle Eastern governments are not conducting the kind of mass surveillance that the US is, but rather targeted surveillance and often targeted attacks on individual users. Some, of course, do also have mass surveillance capabilities. But then there are also, I was in Jordan in January, and people there truly believe that the NSA is handing data over to their government. And to be honest, it wouldn't surprise me, given the other ways that we prop up dictatorships in the Middle East. So yeah, that's mainly the effect that I'm hearing.
Yeah, from this respect, I would like to say that as Italians, we are still waiting a clear answer from our government about that. It's not really clear what's our behavior as an Italian government about this. So that's also because, as Philip said before, there has been no debate almost, at least at a political level, about the Snowden, about the surveillance. And I have a question about social media. Because, of course, social media have been a very strong tool to mobilize people, to help social movements, right? We have seen it also in the Arab Spring, okay. But at the same time, they can be used to get data on users. And also, I think recently there has been also a case in Turkey, apart from the fact that they blocked Twitter, but there has been a case of some people who have been who had a legal problem because of what they tweeted. So, it's kind of, difficult, they are good, but at the same time, they can be used against the same people who are using it. So.
Well, if you look back to the beginning of the Arab Spring in terms of both Tunisia and Egypt, both were caught pretty flat-footed. While they had some ability to apply technologies against protesters, it was very much a blunt instrument, like unplugging the internet. And it didn't work so well. But as you started seeing the protests spread to other countries, places like Bahrain were much more thoughtful, if you will, in ways of using social media as a propaganda tool, as well as sending malware to people so they thought they were signing into Google or signing into Facebook or whatever, but what they were actually doing was logging into a government website, giving away their login and password information. The Syrian government has become notorious among activists in the last couple of years for doing that, and not only targeting activists, but targeting journalists. Activists have learned the hard way about what happens when you don't keep your network secure, but unfortunately there have been incidences where journalists have been compromised, either because of they didn't encrypt properly, or they left their computers behind in a hotel room and had it compromised that way. There are so many potential endpoints to a network. You really only need 1 or 2 points of failure in order to start piecing together who all these other people are. And so, yeah, there's definitely that flip side for using social media. But it's also a cat and mouse game. For every time one social network appears to be compromised, you'll often see activists quietly embracing a new platform to use that for as long as they can until they believe that's been compromised. And then meanwhile, they also know that ultimately anything can be compromised. And so if there's certain things that they need to do more securely and perhaps offline, then they're going to do that too. People aren't using social media just because it gives them better headlines in the West as this romantic social media revolution or something. They use tools that they find practical to their cause. Sometimes that's social media, sometimes it's not. And it's all too easy for us, I think, to just assume that everyone is simply messaging each other on Facebook or Twitter and naively assuming that they're secure, when they're clearly not.
All right. Yes, question.
Hi, thanks very much. Helen Derbyshire from Access Info Europe. I just wanted to come in with a European perspective slightly on this question of the surveillance, because we had the huge scandal that was created by the Snowden revelations, and yet we've had in Europe for a number of years entirely legal retention of our all our telecommunications traffic data under an EU directive, which in most countries, with the exception of Germany and I think Romania, where the constitutional courts had struck them down, was taking place entirely legally. Until, that is, the 10th of April this year, when the European Court of Justice struck down the data retention directive as being disproportionate. So the question is, and we understood that perhaps only better, or the public understood that better, only in the wake of the Snowden revelations, this big scandal which kind of caused us to wake up to this surveillance. I think we've got a challenge. So it's interesting, why was this legitimate surveillance not more of a scandal for journalists? Why wasn't there more noise about that? Why was it only when the Snowden revelations and leaks came along that suddenly did it become news? And also, what's going to happen now in Europe? Because my concern is that having struck down the legal retention of our data is going to continue illegally. And I think that there's a burden on the journalists now to follow that and to ensure and to try to dig and to find out what's happening. So we've got a real concern there. But we need to be, knowing that these things are taking place, I think that there should be more investigative journalism around it and not just waiting for the big leak to happen. I'd be very interested in your comments on that. Thanks.
So I'm going to jump in on this one and kind of, I've always thought that, I mean, absolute great topic to point out, incidentally. I've always been incredibly interested by a lot of the response to huge amounts of the sort of Snowden stuff, which is, well, this is legal. It's like, hey, wait, we're not saying it's not legal. We're saying it's amazing you could do all of this without breaking the law. I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's almost like missing the point. So, you know, lots of bits of law were drafted to sound incredibly innocuous and to really mean nothing to the woefully technologically illiterate people who passed them. The European Parliament has really no one who understands technology. I mean, maybe 2 or 3 thinking about it. Actually, I'm being unfair. The UK Parliament, I can think of 1 MP who understands tech, and sort of Congress, the Supreme Court, really, I mean, honestly, look at blogs about the Supreme Court the last week, and you will weep. And these are the people who are deciding basically our rights online, which are our rights offline. We are not different people on the internet. Online rights are rights. When it comes to the Data Protection Directive, it gets quite interesting. I mean, part of the problem is, the second you say Data Protection Directive, everyone's eyes glaze over. When you start saying storing exactly who you talk to, when, duration of calls, all this kind of information, people get more interested. And I think part of it is, you know, I was one of the people harping on about this directive, and I wonder, we should have been clearer. Even if that sounds alarmist, I mean, this was really happening, this was there. What's interesting is the proposed solution for the US phone records issue is essentially the Data Protection Directive. It's for each phone company to keep records for a certain length of time, and so on. I mean, the bizarre thing is, it is actually a lot better than what the US was doing. It's just still terrible. And so I think, you know, I don't think it's entirely fair to say we all waited for the big leak. I mean, we did cover it, he says defensively. We should have covered it more. We should have covered it more prominently, and we should have done it more clearly. And I think we should carry on to do so. And I think now this has been a flagged issue, it will kind of stay more in the eyes. I'm actually deeply pessimistic as to what the ruling in April will mean for all of our data. What I expect to happen is a minor cosmetic revision to the law so that it will actually need a whole new legal challenge to be found to run against the Human Rights Act again, the ECHR rules again. And so I think they'll do something minor, sort of keep a very similar system running and just try and keep up legal challenges through attrition. It was a good court ruling. It established privacy. It had some good starts, but I'm not optimistic. And so we are going to have to track this closely for a long time.
I'm going to make a quick comment because then we have to run to our next panels. But yeah, I mean, I think there have been a lot of great advocacy groups that have covered that in Europe and in the US. And it's the same thing for me too, because my organization has been suing the NSA since 2006. But nobody, in terms of journalism, very few people were really paying attention to that. And so, I mean, I do think that we owe a lot of credit to Edward Snowden for that, for coming forward, for having the bravery to, to put his face forward and to give those documents over. I think that is what makes the difference. And while a lot of these laws are there and a lot of this information is there, I mean, I also have to give credit, of course. We wouldn't have been suing the NSA if it weren't for Mark Klein, another whistleblower. And so, I do think that that's a huge part of this discussion as well, is how do we get people to pay attention? And sometimes it's that. But thank you. I apologize for having to run early.
Yeah, thank you. But maybe... Yes, we can close here, or if there is a, thank you. If there is still one question for them, and then maybe I think we have to close anyway the panel. So if you want to add something,
I'm going to just repeat something I said a moment ago. As someone who's been writing about this stuff since the 1990s, I see progress in journalists waking up. But I beg everybody here who's a journalist and everyone who knows a journalist and anyone who can contact a journalist to get the public talking about this is fundamental, whether you have a First Amendment or not. This is about freedom of speech. This is about the freedom to gather with other people and have conversations or not. This is about whether you can conduct your financial lives with security and some form of safety. This is about whether you can organize to do whatever you want to do. That's what we're talking about here. And if journalists don't, in every country, put this on the agenda, then journalists will be failing their public and their audience. And I would beg, again, everyone who's involved in this field to simply insist that this be on the agenda. And if that happens, I think we have a better chance of getting this right than, and I'm quite pessimistic as well, because I still don't see this happening.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.